The Last Faith is a 2023 release that can be summed up in a single sentence. It's a 2D Bloodborne with worse writing and voice acting, lacking in originality, but makes up for it with really satisfying gameplay that pays homage to its inspiration. I'm glad I'm discovering this game now rather than at launch. As of January 2026, it's received a substantial mechanical overhaul alongside free DLC. These changes meaningfully improve the experience and elevate the game into something far greater than it was before. Going in, I fully expected to bounce off it after a few hours. The Souls-like genre has been milked dry at this point. It's flooded with games that all chase the same vague mystique, recycle familiar mechanics, and mistake obscured storytelling for depth, as if we all haven't been playing FromSoft's games for the past 15 years. Most of these titles differ only in minor mechanical tweaks or aesthetic choices, rarely offering a compelling reason for their own existence. What sets The Last Faith apart, however, isn't that it's derivative of Dark Souls. Instead, it's derivative of Bloodborne, particularly in its emphasis on aggressive, visceral combat and a well-rounded arsenal of distinctive weapons, all wrapped up in that familiar Lovecraftian aesthetic that Bloodborne is loved for. When approaching games like this, especially in such an oversaturated genre, I tend to ask a simple question: why does this need to exist as a 2D Souls game, beyond the obvious Souls on a budget answer? The reason this matters is because Souls design and Metroidvania design are, at a fundamental level, at odds with one another. Exploration is the backbone of a Metroidvania, shaping everything from level layout to player progression. In contrast, exploration in Souls games primarily serves combat and RPG progression systems rather than existing as a core pillar in its own right. In my opinion, this tension is precisely why From Software's level design became increasingly linear over time, aside from Elden Ring, which begs a totally different discussion. While the first half of Dark Souls is often praised for its interconnected world, the same interconnectedness largely disappears by the midpoint, and exploration itself is rarely engaging beyond navigating spaces while holding a run button, and the stamina meter makes this process a little more cumbersome than necessary. The Last Faith succeeds because it understands these limitations and designs around them instead of fighting against them. Its level design, enemy scaling, weapon progression, exploration upgrades all remain tightly focused. It nods towards Metroidvania conventions through tools like a grapple hook, air dash, and double jump, but never becomes obtuse or overly concerned with making every space loop back in on itself. Progression is largely linear, yet layered with enough misdirection and optional paths that the structure feels intentional rather than restrictive. That focus ultimately pays off because when everything falls into place, the game is free to lean into its greatest strength, the combat. Much like its inspiration, each weapon has a distinct feel thanks largely to special attacks tied to meter, which go a long way in making the arsenal feel meaningful rather than interchangeable. While it doesn't reach the mechanical depth of Bloodborne's transforming weapons, The Last Faith still sticks to landing and making nearly every weapon feel viable and worth experimenting with. This design philosophy extends into the inclusion of guns. Unlike Bloodborne, The Last Faith features a dedicated parry system alongside other defensive abilities, which frees firearms from their traditional role as a reactive tool. As a result, guns function as a legitimate range damage option rather than a situational gimmick. Since weapon skills and spells draw from the same resource, the system naturally encourages experimentation and build variety with all the different tools that are available to you. Another aspect of the combat I really appreciate is the nuance of its parrying system and the variety of executions that can trigger across different enemy types. Rather than replicating Bloodborne's rally mechanic, The Last Faith incentivizes parrying by restoring both health and MP, a smart risk-reward trade-off that keeps combat feeling dynamic instead of routine. Executions, while governed by RNG, allow you to pull off a flashy finishing move on the stunned enemy while recovering health, MP, and even ammunition. I personally never struggled with consumables, as the game is fairly generous in that regard, but executions serve as an important purpose nonetheless. They reduce reliance on items and encourage players to maintain momentum through skillful play and awareness rather than passive resource management. If you're experienced in the genre, this game's difficulty will likely land somewhere in the middle, or even on the easier side. And in my view, that actually works in its favor. As Souls-likes have evolved, the role of difficulty has shifted from something that helped establish tone and atmosphere to something increasingly masochistic, with enemy movesets growing more bloated and excessive with each new release. The Last Faith strikes a far healthier balance. Enemies and bosses remain consistently engaging without ever tripping into needlessly punishing territory. Newcomers to the genre, however, will still get their asses handed to them. For my part, I rarely died to any boss more than a handful of times, and after playing these games for nearly half my life, that comes as a genuine relief. The familiar process of bashing your head against the wall until every encounter is memorized has long since lost its appeal for me. There's real value in restraint, far more than in cranking difficulty to extremes simply to justify a game's existence. Lies of P occupies a similar space for me, which likely explains why it stands alongside The Last Faith as one of my favorite non-From Software Souls-likes. That said, the game's shortcomings aren't major failures so much as small, persistent irritations that can compound over time. For starters, the absence of basics like a forward roll attack or crouching attacks is surprising. Whether this comes down to budget limitations or short-sighted design, their omission is noticeable. Thankfully, the core combat is strong enough that these gaps are ultimately forgivable, but they shouldn't be there in the first place. Another issue is the inability to use items directly from the inventory menu. For some reason I genuinely cannot explain, you're forced to equip an item to a limited quick slot just to use it, even if it's something niche you'll immediately unequip afterwards. It's a small design choice that becomes a significant annoyance over time, especially given the already awkward D-pad item navigation inherited from traditional Souls design. This friction is compounded by the surprisingly restrictive number of offhand slots available for spells and guns. For some reason you only get 2? If, like me, you dedicate one slot to a firearm and the other to a spell, you'll find yourself dipping into the menu far more often than you should. Airborne enemies are a good example. They can sit just outside the reach of a jump attack, making vertical or arcing spells the obvious solution. But keeping a gun equipped is often preferred because MP can drain quickly. The result is a steady stream of unnecessary menu rummaging, an issue that could have been easily mitigated with a single additional slot. Personally, I'm also not a fan of these insta-kill death pits in these Soulsvanias. These games live and die by platforming flow and exploration, and instant death falls do nothing but disrupt that rhythm. I actually dropped the original Blasphemous for this exact reason. Platforming was never a core pillar of traditional Souls games. It was often awkward and heavily constrained, so transplanting those punishments into a 2D space feels misguided. While The Last Faith thankfully uses these pits sparingly, their inclusion becomes outright absurd in some cases once you realize the game has no fall damage. Falling from a height that should logically lead into another room instead results in instant death. Symphony of the Night solved this nearly 30 years ago, and there's no excuse here. Furthermore, the dialogue in The Last Faith is, for lack of a better phrase, trying too hard. What the game does understand about Souls-style storytelling is the dreary, indifferent delivery directed at the player. What it completely misses, however, is restraint. Characters speak at length, often well past the point of necessity, and frequently lapse into dialogue that feels overly written and contrived. Eric himself fares no better. He has little to no real agency or presence in these exchanges, rarely reacting in any meaningful way. More often than not, he exists solely to lob predictable follow-up questions so that NPCs can continue monologuing. He may as well have been a silent protagonist, as his contributions add nothing of value to these conversations majority of the time. And compounding this issue is the voice acting, which leaves a lot to be desired. Outside of a few instances, it's undeniably amateurish, yet performed with an air of self-importance that suggests it wants to be taken seriously. The result is a tonal mismatch that consistently undermines whatever atmosphere the dialogue is attempting to create. With all of that said, I'm still very impressed with The Last Faith, so much so that it's managed to do what most Soulsvanias fail to do for me: compel me to actually keep playing. I'm nearing the end of my New Game Plus run as I write this, and I have every intention to continue beyond that. Exploration remains engaging without overstaying its welcome, combat holds up across repeated playthroughs, and the game features a solid lineup of bosses that are consistently enjoyable to fight. Much of this success comes down to the game's restraint. The Last Faith doesn't participate in the Souls arms race by inflating difficulty to obnoxious levels as a way of justifying its existence. Instead, it trusts its systems and mechanics, its pacing, and its combat design. Even for players well versed in the genre, the game continues to surprise with its overall quality, and more importantly, it leaves you wanting more.